July 2nd, 1973, 9:47 a.m. Frank Matthews walked out of his luxury apartment in Brooklyn carrying a single leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was $20 million in cash. The FBI had 50 agents stationed across New York City, waiting to arrest America's biggest drug kingpin. 48 years later, nobody knows where he went. Not the FBI, not the DEA, not even the people who loved him most. This is the story of the greatest disappearing act in criminal history. To understand how Frank Matthews pulled off what the FBI called the impossible escape, you need to know who he was. This wasn't just another drug dealer. This was Black Caesar, a man who, by 1973, controlled the largest black-owned drug empire in American history. A man who made millions while the Italian Mafia watched in disbelief. A man who went directly to the source in France and broke the stranglehold the five families had on heroin distribution. Frank Matthews was born in 1944 in Durham, North Carolina. His childhood was poverty. His mother died when he was young. By age 15, he was in Philadelphia, hustling on the streets, learning the game from the bottom up. But Matthews wasn't like the other hustlers. He was intelligent, strategic, patient. While others fought over street corners, Matthews studied the system. He asked questions nobody else was asking. Where does the product really come from? Who controls the supply? And most importantly, why couldn't a black man go straight to the source? By 1968, Matthews had moved to Brooklyn and started building something the criminal underworld had never seen before. A nationwide drug distribution network run entirely by black operators, independent of the Italian Mafia. The traditional model said you bought from the Italians, you paid their prices, you followed their rules. Matthews said no. He went to the French connection suppliers in Marseille directly. He cut out the middleman. He paid less, sold more, and kept the profits. The Italian Mafia was furious. Who was this 24-year-old black kid from North Carolina telling the five families he didn't need them? They tried intimidation first. Matthews didn't flinch. They tried negotiation. Matthews refused. They put a price on his head. Matthews disappeared for 3 weeks, then came back with armed security and expanded into 3 new cities. The message was clear. Black Caesar wasn't asking for permission. He was taking his place at the table. By 1971, Frank Matthews was operating in 21 states. His organization moved hundreds of kilos of heroin and cocaine monthly. He had distributors in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Miami, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. His annual revenue was estimated at $100 million. In today's money, that's over $700 million. And he did it all while staying almost completely invisible to the public. No flashy cars, no jewelry, no magazine interviews. If you weren't in the game, you'd never heard of Frank Matthews. But here's where it gets truly shocking. While Matthews was building this empire, he was simultaneously planning something else, something nobody suspected. Not his partners, not his lieutenants, not even his common-law wife, Cheryl Denise Brown. For 2 full years, from 1971 to 1973, Frank Matthews was methodically preparing his exit strategy. The planning was meticulous. Matthews opened bank accounts in offshore tax havens under aliases. He purchased properties in countries with no extradition treaties to the United States. He acquired multiple fake passports with different names. He moved cash incrementally, never large enough to trigger alerts, always through different channels. He befriended corrupt officials in 3 foreign governments, and he did all of this while running a drug empire that required his attention 7 days a week. What Matthews understood, what made him different from every other kingpin, was that this life had one inevitable ending. You either went to prison, you got killed, or you disappeared. Prison and death were what happened to people who waited too long. Disappearing required preparation, and Frank Matthews was nothing if not prepared. By early 1973, the federal government was closing in. The DEA had been investigating Matthews for 18 months. They had informants inside his organization. They had wiretaps on his phones. They had surveillance teams following his associates. Matthews knew all of this. His counter-surveillance was so sophisticated that he often knew where federal agents were before they knew where he was. But he also knew that eventually they'd have enough for an indictment. The question wasn't if they'd come for him. The question was when. May 1973. Federal prosecutors in Brooklyn were building their case. They had testimony from low-level distributors who'd flipped. They had financial records showing millions in unexplained cash. They had surveillance photos of Matthews meeting with known drug suppliers. The lead prosecutor told his team, "We'll have him in custody by September. He's not going anywhere." But the prosecutor didn't know what Frank Matthews knew. He didn't know that Matthews had already decided. The countdown had begun. June 1973. Matthews started moving faster. Money that had been in safety deposit boxes across Brooklyn was consolidated. Associates were paid final bonuses and told to expect new instructions soon. Properties were quietly sold through third parties. Matthews took a trip to Miami, then to Las Vegas, meeting with his most trusted distributors. To everyone, it looked like business as usual. But every move was deliberate. Every meeting was a goodbye that nobody recognized as a goodbye. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because what happened in those final weeks, who Matthews contacted, where he went, what deals he made, most of it remains unknown even today. What we do know comes from fragments, from people who saw him during those weeks and didn't realize they were seeing him for the last time, from investigators who pieced together his movements years later, always arriving too late, always one step behind a ghost. July 1st, 1973. Matthews was in his Brooklyn apartment with Cheryl Denise Brown. According to witnesses, he seemed calm, relaxed even. He made phone calls, normal conversation. He met with 3 of his top lieutenants at a restaurant on Flatbush Avenue. They discussed distributions, territories, money flows. One of those men later told investigators that Matthews seemed distant, like his mind was somewhere else. Another said, "He shook my hand differently that day, held it longer, looked me in the eye longer. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. Later, I realized he was saying goodbye." That night, Matthews made a phone call that would haunt the recipient for decades. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. What was said in those 4 minutes has never been fully disclosed. But the person on the other end later told investigators that Matthews's final words were, "Tell everyone I said goodbye. Tell them Black Caesar played the game better than anyone. And tell them, if they're smart, they'll remember how I won by knowing when to walk away." July 2nd, 1973, 9:47 a.m. Frank Matthews, wearing a conservative gray suit, walked out of 1178 Prospect Place in Brooklyn. He was carrying a leather briefcase. Cheryl Denise Brown was with him. They got into a taxi. The taxi drove them to Kennedy Airport. And then Frank Matthews disappeared. Wait, don't miss this detail. Because what happened at the airport is where the legend truly begins. Matthews and Brown checked in for a flight to Los Angeles. They had tickets. They went through security. Witnesses saw them in the terminal. They boarded the plane. The plane took off at 11:32 a.m. But when the plane landed in Los Angeles, Frank Matthews and Cheryl Denise Brown were not on it. Think about that for a moment. They boarded the plane in New York. The plane flew to Los Angeles. But they weren't on the plane when it landed. The FBI later investigated this intensely. How did they get off? Did they deplane during a stop? Did they have help from airline staff? Did they change appearance and switch tickets mid-flight? To this day, nobody knows. The airline had no record of them deplaning. No witnesses saw them leave. It was as if they vanished into thin air at 30,000 feet. The FBI didn't realize Matthews was gone until July 5th, 3 full days after he disappeared. When they went to arrest him on the morning of July 5th, the apartment was empty, cleaned out. No clothes, no personal items, no indication anyone had lived there. Neighbors said they saw Matthews leave on July 2nd, but thought nothing of it. He traveled for business all the time. One neighbor told investigators, "We figured he'd be back in a week." The investigation that followed became one of the largest manhunts in DEA history. Agents searched 21 states. They followed leads to Mexico, to Venezuela, to West Africa, to France. They interviewed hundreds of Matthews's associates. They traced financial records through dozens of banks. They analyzed flight manifests, hotel registries, car rentals, and they found nothing. It was as if Frank Matthews had simply ceased to exist on July 2nd, 1973. But here's the truly shocking part. The investigation revealed just how well Matthews had planned his disappearance. Agents discovered that he'd been using at least 7 different aliases since 1971. He had properties in 4 countries that investigators only discovered months after he'd vanished, and by the time they found the properties, they'd been sold. He had bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, in Switzerland, in Panama, all under different names, all emptied within weeks of his disappearance. The money trail went cold in so many different directions that investigators couldn't possibly follow them all. And the $20 million? That wasn't everything. That was just what Matthews took with him that morning. Investigators later estimated that Matthews had successfully hidden or moved between $50 and $100 million in the 2 years before he disappeared. Money that was in offshore accounts, in real estate, in gold, in investments under false names. Money that could sustain him for the rest of his life without ever needing to touch the criminal world again. Years passed. The FBI kept the case open, but the leads dried up. Every so-called sighting of Matthews turned out to be someone else. Every tip led nowhere. By 1980, most investigators privately admitted they'd never find him. By 1990, Matthews had become a legend in the criminal underworld. The man who beat the system. The man who walked away on his own terms. Some people claim Matthews died years ago, maybe in Venezuela in 1985, maybe in West Africa in 1992, maybe in Mexico in 2007. Every few years, someone comes forward claiming to have seen him, claiming to know where he is. Every claim has been investigated. None has been verified. Other people believe Matthews is still alive, living under a new identity, perhaps in a country with no extradition treaty, perhaps looking like an ordinary businessman, an ordinary retiree, someone you'd pass on the street and never look twice at. The man who was once Black Caesar, one of the most powerful criminals in America, now just another face in the crowd. The truth is, we may never know. Frank Matthews executed the perfect disappearing act. He planned for years. He stayed disciplined. He kept his secrets even from the people closest to him. And when the moment came, he walked away without looking back. What we do know is this. Frank Matthews showed that the game could be played differently, that a black man from the South could build an empire that rivaled the Italian Mafia. That intelligence and strategy mattered more than violence and flash. That the smartest move sometimes isn't staying and fighting, it's knowing when to leave. The FBI officially lists Frank Matthews as a fugitive to this day. His case file remains open. If he's still alive, he'd be 79 years old. Somewhere in the world, there might be an elderly man who knows exactly what happened on July 2nd, 1973. A man who has kept the greatest secret in criminal history for nearly 5 decades. A man who proved that sometimes the only way to truly win the game is to stop playing it. This was Frank Matthews. Black Caesar. The man who disappeared with $20 million. The man the FBI never found. The man who showed the world that the perfect escape isn't impossible. You just have to be patient enough, smart enough, and disciplined enough to plan it right.